Helen lived in a modest house, surrounded by ancient trees that told stories as old as herself. At 78 years old, loneliness was an old acquaintance. Since her husband left, the house seemed bigger, the days longer, and the silence deeper. She liked to say that the wind, shaking the windows, was the only company she had on cold nights. But that changed the day Thor came into her life. It was a typical autumn morning, with the sky tinted orange and the smell of damp earth wafting through the air. Helen was at the nearby village market choosing fruits and vegetables when she heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from a cardboard box leaning against the wall. Curious, she approached it, and when she looked inside the box, her heart sank. A pit bull puppy lay there, curled up and shaking, its eyes as bright as a starry night but filled with sadness. He was thin, fragile, and there was something in those eyes that begged for care, for a chance. Without thinking twice, Helen took him in her arms. The puppy licked his fingers shyly, as if he understood he was being saved. "You will be called Thor," she said with a smile that had not lit up her face for a long time. At that moment, something changed in his heart. It wasn't just the puppy that needed help. She needed him too. In the days that followed, Thor brought new energy to Helen's life. The cub, who before seemed so fragile, turned out to be a little warrior. He ran around the house, explored the yard, and every now and then got up to some mischief that made Helen laugh like she hadn't done in years. At night, he would curl up at the foot of her armchair while she knitted or read her favorite novels. The loneliness that previously dominated the days gave way to a routine full of small moments of joy. Thor wasn't just a companion. He seemed to understand Helen in a unique way. When she was sad, he would lay his head on her lap, as if to say, "I'm here for you." When she laughed, he wagged his tail enthusiastically, as if he wanted to share her happiness. The two became inseparable. On every walk through the garden, Thor accompanied her, always attentive to every sound and movement. It was as if he knew that his mission was to protect Helen, and he did it with a dedication that moved. In Thor's presence, she felt something that had long seemed lost: security. The emptiness that once seemed to fill every corner of that house gave way to a home full of life. Helen's days, once monotonous, gained color. She realized that by saving Thor in that market, she had in fact saved herself. The little cub had grown, but the love and connection between them only grew. Thor wasn't just a dog, he was her family, her guardian, her most loyal friend. And with him by her side, Helen discovered that she would never be alone again. Thor entered Helen's life like a storm on a peaceful day, disrupting the monotonous routine she had built after the loss of her husband. When she found him that day at the market, she didn't know she was taking home not just a dog, but a piece of the love she thought she had lost forever. Over time, Thor and Helen built something that words could not describe: a special bond, a bond that would not be broken, even in the quietest and most difficult moments. Every day, Helen saw something in Thor that made her feel alive again. When she spoke to him, and she spoke a lot, as if Thor understood every word, he looked at her with those attentive eyes, like someone listening with his heart. It didn't matter if she was complaining about back pain or remembering a happy story from the past. Thor was there, by her side, like a friend who didn't judge, just welcomed. But what made Thor unique was his instinct. It seemed like he felt everything before it even happened. When the wind blew stronger and the windows shook, he would get up, ears perked up, and walk through the house like a sentry. If a car stopped nearby, even before the sound of the engine disappeared, Thor was already at the door, paying attention, as if to ensure that no one would dare disturb Helen. Helen knew that Thor wasn't just a protective dog. He was her guardian. There was a night when she woke up to a strange sound coming from the garden. Frightened, she walked to the window and saw Thor standing near the fence, his hair standing on end, his gaze fixed on the dark. He didn't bark, but there was something in his posture that said, "You're safe because I'm here." And somehow, that was enough to reassure her. This constant protection, however, did not just come from instinct. It came from love. Thor didn't just take care of Helen because he felt it was his role. He did this because he knew she was his person, his family. She had saved him in a moment of vulnerability, and now he gave back every day, with every look, every lick, and every act of courage. In the moments when Helen felt the weight of age or the absence of her old life, Thor seemed to know exactly what to do. He would lay his head on her lap, nudging it gently with his nose as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." And she, with a soft smile, passed her hand over his head, feeling that connection so simple but so deep that only truly connected hearts can understand. The bond between Donna Helen and Thor was not just friendship. It was a kind of love that transcended words and gestures. It was a love that filled the empty spaces in the house, that made time seem less cruel, and that reminded Helen that, despite the losses, life could still be sweet. Thor wasn't just a cub. He was the heart beating next to hers, reminding her every day that together they were stronger, happier, and above all, never alone. Everything seemed to be going well for Helen and Thor. The quiet days were filled with walks in the garden, Helen's long conversations with her faithful friend, and silent nights in the small country house. However, something began to change. Thor's once calm and protective demeanor became restless, as if he sensed something was wrong. It all started one autumn night. Helen was in bed, trying to sleep to the sound of the wind that whistled through the windows. Thor, who usually slept at the foot of his bed, stood up suddenly, his ears perked up. He walked to the door and began to emit a low growl, almost inaudible, but which made Helen sit up in bed, alarmed. "What is it, Thor?" she asked, her voice shaking. He didn't respond, of course, but his posture said it all. Something outside wasn't right. The next morning, Helen tried to ignore what happened, attributing Thor's behavior to the sound of the wind or to some animal that had passed through the garden. However, in the following days, Thor's reactions intensified. He began to patrol the house frequently, stopping in front of the windows and staring outside. At night, she barked constantly, her eyes staring into the darkness, as if trying to warn her about something she couldn't see. It was on one of these mornings, after a particularly restless night, that Helen encountered something that made her freeze for a moment. In the garden, near the fence that surrounded his property, there were footprints. They were too big to be Thor's and didn't look like any animal she knew. They were human. Helen tried to convince herself that it could be from a neighbor who had gotten lost or passed by, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. The location of the footprints was strange, as if someone had been prowling around the house. Each day, the tension seemed to increase. Thor became increasingly vigilant, as if he were determined to protect her from an unseen danger. Helen began to take precautions. He started locking all the doors and windows before going to sleep, something he rarely did in his quiet country life. Even during the day, he felt uncomfortable going out into the garden. Fear began to settle in silently, and she realized that, although Thor was by her side, something was stealing the peace that previously reigned in her home. Helen didn't want to bother the neighbors with her worries, but every night of poor sleep, with Thor growling or barking at something beyond her eyesight, she felt she should ask for help. However, he hesitated. Part of her didn't want to believe she could be in danger. But looking at Thor and his increasingly protective stance, I knew he wasn't reacting by chance. Something or someone was out there, and he would do anything to protect her. The nights continued, and Thor's restlessness only grew. Helen began to notice that her own home, once a haven of peace, now seemed shrouded in a sense of constant threat. She didn't know what awaited her, but one thing was certain. With Thor by her side, she would face whatever came her way. Even without knowing exactly what it was, she began to prepare herself, trusting in her companion's loyalty and instinct. After all, Thor had always been more than a dog. He was her guardian, and now he seemed more alert than ever. The night was especially dark, with dense clouds covering the sky and a threatening storm that seemed to grow stronger by the minute. The wind was blowing strong, making the trees around Helen's house sway, as if whispering a warning. The rain pounded on the windows, creating an unsettling symphony, while thunder roared in the distance, announcing that the storm was just beginning. Helen, in her favorite armchair, was reading one of her old books. Thor, as usual, was lying next to the door, but something about him didn't seem normal that night. He was restless, lifting his head at every sound coming from outside. His watchful eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the door, and his body seemed ready for any movement. Helen noticed and tried to reassure him. "It's okay, Thor. It must just be the wind," she said, trying to convince herself as much as the dog, but Thor would not calm down. He stood up suddenly, walking slowly to the door, where he began to emit a low, continuous growl. It was a sound Helen rarely heard, a clear warning that something was wrong. It was then that Helen heard it too. Steps. Not light footsteps like those of some small animal, but heavy footsteps, which made the porch boards creak. Helen's heart raced. Who could be there? At that time and in the middle of a storm. Before she could react, she heard a loud knock on the door, followed by an even louder knock. Thor began to bark furiously, positioning himself between Helen and the door like a true guardian. Then, with a deafening bang, the door was broken down, and two masked men burst into the house. Helen was paralyzed. Time seemed to slow down as she tried to process what was happening. The men shouted, demanding that she be quiet. One of them held an iron bar, while the other began to search the room, knocking over objects in search of anything of value. Helen could barely move, but Thor didn't hesitate. With a ferocious roar that echoed through the house, he charged at the first invader, knocking him to the ground with the force of his attack. The man screamed in pain as Thor bit his arm, and his weapon fell to the ground. The second man, surprised by the dog's reaction, tried to intervene, but Thor was quick and determined. He released the first invader only to lunge at the second, who tripped and fell onto a table, breaking it into pieces. The living room, once so peaceful, had transformed into a scene of struggle and chaos. The sound of Thor's barking, the screams of the invaders, and the thunder outside created a terrifying atmosphere. Helen, still in shock, tried to move, but her feet seemed stuck to the floor. She watched helplessly as Thor fought with all his strength to protect the house and its owner. One of the attackers managed to get up and picked up a piece of wood from the broken table. With a quick blow, he hit Thor in the back, causing the dog to fall with a groan of pain. Helen screamed when she saw her faithful friend injured, but Thor, despite being hurt, got up again. His eyes glowed with fierce determination as he positioned himself between the men and Helen, growling as if to say, "You'll have to get past me first." The man with the wood advanced again, but Thor was agile and dodged the attack, biting the invader's leg with enough force to knock him down once again. The second man, seeing that the situation was out of control, tried to escape, but Thor didn't allow it. He chased it to the door, barking and growling, as the first intruder tried to crawl away. At that moment, Helen was finally able to move. She ran to the kitchen where she grabbed the phone with shaking hands and dialed the police. His voice was cracked with fear as he explained the situation. "Two men broke into my house. My dog, he's fighting," he managed to say before a sob escaped his lips. The operator assured her that help was on the way, but Helen knew that every second was crucial. She returned to the room and saw Thor still facing the invaders, even with clear signs of fatigue and injuries. The floor was marked by footprints, broken glass, and bloodstains, but Thor did not back down. He fought as if his own life didn't matter, as if the only thing that mattered was protecting Helen. Thor's sacrifice that night was forever etched in Helen's memory. He was exhausted, injured, but he didn't back down. Even with his body bruised by the invaders' blows, Thor continued to advance, his determination being greater than the pain he certainly felt. His eyes were fixed on the thieves, his body instinctively placing itself as a barrier between them and Helen. He knew he was the only obstacle between those dangerous men and the person he loved most. Helen, who until then had felt helpless, watched the scene with a broken heart. Thor's every movement was a mixture of courage and desperation. He was fighting with all his might, but fatigue was starting to take its toll. When one of the thieves stood up again, holding a piece of broken wood and ready to attack Thor once more, something changed inside her. Fear gave way to fierce determination, a courage she didn't even know she possessed. She could no longer stand still. His eyes darted around the room until he found a knife that one of the thieves had dropped during the fight. Without thinking twice, she ran over to the object, her hands shaking as she picked it up. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, but the sight of Thor, panting and fighting for her, gave her strength. Helen, a 78-year-old woman who had never imagined finding herself in such an extreme situation, felt overcome by a wave of protection that overcame any hesitation. "Don't touch my dog!" His voice, firm and full of determination, echoed throughout the room. The advancing thief hesitated for a moment, surprised by the lady's courage. It was enough for Thor, even though he was injured, to find an opening to attack again. He lunged at the man, knocking him down with a leap, while Helen, knife in hand, positioned herself between Thor and the other invader. The room seemed to pulse with tension. The second thief took a step towards her, trying to intimidate her, but Helen didn't back down. She held the knife firmly, her hands no longer shook. "You're not going to hurt anyone else here," she declared, with a courage that even she didn't recognize. The thief, realizing that the situation had gotten completely out of control, began to back away. But Helen knew she couldn't relax. Thor, even at the limit of his strength, remained in an attack position, ready to protect his owner once again, if necessary. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Helen and Thor were exhausted, but they held firm until finally the sound of sirens cut through the silence of the night. The thieves, realizing they were cornered, tried to escape, but were unable to do so. Thor, despite being injured, prevented one of them from escaping, while the police invaded the house and quickly arrested the two men. Only then, when the threat was eliminated, did Thor allow himself to fall to the ground. His body was shaking, his wounds were bleeding, but he still looked at Helen, as if he wanted to make sure she was okay. Helen ran to him, kneeling beside him and wrapping her arms around him. "You were amazing, my darling. You saved my life," she said, tears streaming down her face. As the police took the thieves away, one of the paramedics approached to help Thor. Helen, with a choked voice, explained what had happened, her hand never ceasing to caress her faithful friend's head. "He's more than a dog. He's my hero," she said, her voice full of gratitude and love. That night, while accompanying Thor to the veterinary clinic, Helen reflected on what she had witnessed. Thor, even in the face of danger, even injured, had given his all to protect her. He didn't back down, he didn't hesitate, and his sacrifice was the purest proof of love and loyalty she had ever experienced. And now it was her turn to give back. She would do anything to ensure that Thor received the care he needed and that they remained together, because after that night Helen knew that her life would never be the same. The veterinarian, an experienced man with a compassionate look, examined Thor quickly and seriously. "He's seriously injured, but we're going to do everything we can," he said before disappearing behind the operating room doors. Helen stayed in the waiting room, alone with her thoughts and prayers. Every minute seemed like an eternity. The hours dragged by. Helen couldn't sit or rest. She paced back and forth, her eyes fixed on the door that separated the operating room from the reception. Finally, the vet came out, looking tired but hopeful. "Thor's a fighter," he said. "We managed to stabilize him. The next 48 hours will be critical, but if he continues to react well, I believe he will have a good chance of recovery." The relief Helen felt was immediate, but the tears didn't stop falling. She thanked the vet repeatedly before being led to where Thor rested. He was lying on a makeshift bed, connected to medical equipment that monitored his vital signs. His eyes were half closed, but when he heard Helen's voice, he made an effort to lift his head slightly. "Shh, my hero. You've done a lot. Now it's time to rest," she said, sitting next to him and stroking his head tenderly. The following days were a challenge. Thor faced fever, pain, and difficulty moving, but with each new day, he showed small signs of recovery. Helen didn't leave his side for even a moment. She would bring a small chair to sit next to his bed, holding his paw and telling him stories. "Remember when you saved me from that scare with the fox in the garden? You were always so brave, my Thor," she said, while he looked at her with his tired but confident eyes. Recovery was slow. Thor needed physical therapy to regain strength in his hind legs and a lot of care for his wounds to heal. Helen insisted on participating in each stage. She learned from the veterinarians how to help him get up, how to apply medications, and how to massage his muscles to relieve stiffness. It was a tiring routine, but she never complained. Taking care of Thor was her way of repaying everything he had done for her. Over time, Thor began to take small steps. At first, it was just a timid movement of the tail or an effort to get up from the bed. But little by little, he started walking again, eating with more appetite and even wagging his tail with the energy that Helen knew and loved so much. Every progress, no matter how small, was celebrated with tears and hugs. The day Thor was able to walk to the garden again was special. Helen opened the door of the house, and he came out with still, slow, but determined steps. The sun was shining, and the birds were singing, as if they were celebrating Thor's strength. Helen followed him closely with a smile on her lips and her heart full of gratitude. After that unforgettable night, the relationship between Helen and Thor transcended any bond they had ever shared before. If before he was her faithful companion, now he was a piece of her own soul. Thor had sacrificed everything to protect her, and this not only saved her life, but rekindled something in Helen that she didn't even know still existed. A purpose. As Thor continued his recovery, the story of his bravery began to spread throughout the community. The police officers who responded to the call told about the sacrifice of the dog, which, despite being injured, never gave up protecting its owner. Soon neighbors who had previously only waved from afar began to appear at Helen's door, bringing words of admiration, gifts for Thor, and even food to help with her recovery. "He's a hero," everyone said. "What he did for you was something we will never forget." Helen, despite the sudden attention, remained humble. Whenever someone praised Thor, she would just smile and caress her friend, saying, "He's more than a hero. He is my family." She knew that Thor's unconditional love was rare, and it made her reflect on all the other animals that could be waiting for a second chance, just as Thor had waited that day at the market. One day, as she sat in the garden with Thor, watching him play more energetically than in previous weeks, Helen had an idea. What if she could repay what Thor had done for her, helping other animals who, like him, were abandoned, vulnerable, and looking for love? The thought grew inside her, like a small seed that quickly blossomed. That was it. She knew she had found a new purpose. Helen started simply. He visited an animal shelter in the neighboring town and asked how he could help. The volunteers, upon hearing his story, were touched. She started donating food and blankets to the shelter, but wanted to do more. So he began to temporarily welcome animals into his home until they were adopted. Thor, always by his side, seemed to understand what was happening. Each time a new animal arrived, he welcomed it with the patience and care that only he seemed to possess. It was as if he knew that now his mission was not only to protect Helen, but also to help guide other animals to a new life. In a short time, Helen's house became a true refuge. The once silent garden was now filled with the sound of running paws, excited barking, and the purring of cats who found solace in the company of Helen and Thor. Neighbors started calling the place the animal's paradise. Each animal that passed through the house carried a story of abandonment, but left with a new chance to be happy. Helen felt like she was living a second life. Every day she woke up with more energy and determination, something she thought she had lost with age. Thor, now completely recovered, was her faithful shadow, accompanying her on visits to the shelter, playing with the newly arrived animals, and even posing for photos that Helen used to publicize the stories of the animals looking for adoption. The community was also impacted by Helen and Thor's transformation. Many people, inspired by Thor's courage and Helen's dedication, began adopting animals from the shelter or offering help. Helen had never felt so connected to her neighbors. "It's not just about saving animals," she said. "It's about saving ourselves by offering love and a second chance to those who need it." One afternoon, as she watched Thor run around the garden with a group of puppies she had recently rescued, Helen smiled to herself. That house, which before seemed so big and empty, was now overflowing with life, joy, and purpose. Thor, her hero and inspiration, had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. He taught her that even in the most difficult situations, love and loyalty have the power to change everything. Helen knew she couldn't change the entire world, but for every animal that passed through her home, she was changing an entire world. And while Thor rested in the shade of a tree, she came and sat down beside him and stroked his head. "You've given me a reason to keep going, Thor," she said, her eyes shining. "And together, we will continue to spread this love for as long as we have." The story of Helen and Thor is not just a narrative about courage, sacrifice, and love. It's a powerful reminder of how small acts can transform lives. Thor was just an abandoned, fragile, and hopeless cub when Helen decided to open her heart and her home to him. Little did she know that years later, he would repay this gesture with his own life, protecting her in her moment of greatest need. This connection between Helen and Thor teaches us that, even in the most difficult times, love and loyalty can overcome any adversity. It's a story that inspires us to look at others, whether people or animals, and recognize that everyone deserves a chance to be loved and protected. If you, like Helen, have already felt the impact that an act of kindness can have, or if you believe that stories like this have the power to inspire more people to do good, don't let this message stop here. Share this story with friends, family, and anyone you believe needs to hear that love is still the greatest force there is. And don't stop there. There are so many other stories like Helen and Thor waiting to be told. Stories of courage, resilience, and hope that can touch more people's hearts and bring inspiration for your own challenges. So, subscribe to the channel and follow more stories like this. Together we can spread messages of love and compassion, creating a chain of inspiration that can reach even more lives. Your participation makes all the difference. Like, share, and subscribe. Your every action helps keep alive the mission of telling stories that move, teach, and remind us of what really matters in life: love, loyalty, and the desire to do good. Let's take this message forward together.